In the bustling heart of Chicago, Eleanor Grace was a force to be reckoned with. At 48, she had climbed to the top of her industry, earning her peers' respect and sometimes envy. Her name was synonymous with success, her days filled with back-to-back meetings, strategic decisions, and a life that demanded nothing short of excellence. But one cold autumn morning, amidst her meticulously scheduled chaos, Eleanor received a voicemail that would shatter the order she had worked so hard to maintain. "Eleanor, it's your father. Please call me back. It's important." The message was short, hesitant, and carried the weight of urgency. But Eleanor, used to filtering through demands for her attention, dismissed it. Later, she thought, preparing for yet another board presentation. Later, it turned into a week, then two. And when Eleanor finally remembered the call, it was too late. Her father, the one she had carefully distanced herself from for over a decade, was gone. His funeral would be held in the small coastal town she had sworn never to return to, a place filled with memories she had worked tirelessly to forget. What could he have wanted to tell her in those final moments? Why had he reached out after all these years? And what secrets had he taken to the grave? Eleanor's mind swirled with unanswered questions, but one thing was clear. Her carefully crafted life was about to unravel in ways she could never have imagined. Are you ready to uncover the truth behind Eleanor's journey? Subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories exploring life, love, and family complexities. What would you do if faced with the echoes of the past? Let us know in the comments below. Sometimes, the answers we seek lie buried in the places we least want to look. Don't miss this incredible story of redemption and discovery. Hit that like button and join our community of storytellers today. Eleanor stood outside her office window, staring at the city skyline she had once conquered. She had spent years burying her past under layers of success, yet now, all those memories clawed back to the surface. Sitting unopened on her pristine desk, the funeral invitation felt heavier than it should be. She had ignored her father's voicemail, the town she grew up in, and the family history she was too proud or scared to confront. She sighed, finally picking up the invitation. The words were simple. In loving memory of James Grace, beloved father and friend. The pang of guilt hit her hard. Had she known him? Or had she only clung to the image of the man who let their family fall apart after her mother's death? That evening, Eleanor booked her flight. She told herself it was out of obligation, a final duty as his daughter, but deep down, she felt something more. An invisible thread was pulling her back to a life she had abandoned. The drive to her childhood home was disorienting. Fields of golden wheat replaced the Chicago skyline, the hum of the city with the quiet stillness of the countryside. When she pulled up to the modest white house, now weathered with age, Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. It looked untouched by time, yet somehow smaller, almost fragile. The door creaked as she stepped inside, and the familiar smell of wood polish and lavender filled her senses. Everything looked just as she remembered. Her father's worn armchair by the fireplace, the dining table where they used to sit for Sunday dinners. But there was something new on the mantel, a small, ornate box with intricate carvings. Her name was etched on a tag tied to its handle. "What's this?" she whispered aloud, reaching for it. Before she could open it, a voice interrupted her. "Eleanor?" She turned to see an older man standing in the doorway. His face was lined with age, but his piercing blue eyes were unmistakable. It was Tom Ashford, her father's lifelong friend and attorney. "Tom," Eleanor said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Tom stepped forward, his expression a mix of sorrow and resolve. "Your father asked me to meet you here. He left some instructions, and a lot of unanswered questions." Eleanor frowned. "Instructions? For what?" Tom gestured to the box in her hands. "He wanted you to have that after he was gone. Said it would explain everything." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine as she slowly opened the box. Inside was a single key and a letter written in her father's handwriting. "Dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, I didn't get to tell you in person. I'm sorry for that. But you need to know something I should have told you long ago. This key opens a door to a part of our family's past you've never known. A past I hoped you'd never have to confront. But now, it's time. Look for the small chapel at the edge of Willow Creek. Inside, you'll find the answers you've been searching for. I hope you'll find it in your heart to forgive me. Love always, Dad. Eleanor stared at the letter, her heart pounding. What did he mean by a part of our family's past? Why hadn't he told her this sooner? And what could be waiting for her at Willow Creek? Tom placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. Your father carried a heavy burden, Eleanor. Whatever this is, he wanted you to know the truth. It won't be easy, but I think you owe it to yourself to find out. Eleanor nodded, her resolve hardening. For the first time in years, she felt the pull of something greater than her ambition. She didn't know what she would find at Willow Creek, but one thing was sure. Her father had left her with more than just a mystery. He had left her with the chance to rewrite the story of their family. The following day, Eleanor set out for Willow Creek. The drive was short, but every twist and turn of the winding road brought bareback childhood memories. She had spent summers exploring these woods, laughing with friends, and escaping into the pages of books. But this time, the beauty of the landscape was overshadowed by the weight of her father's words. The chapel stood at the creek's edge, shrouded in ivy and framed by towering oaks. It was small, almost forgotten, with its stained glass windows cracked and its steeple leaning slightly to the right. Eleanor had seen it before in passing, but she had never been inside. The old wooden door groaned open as she approached, revealing a dimly lit interior. The smell of aged wood and faint incense filled the air. At the center of the room was a single wooden chest, its lock matching the key in Eleanor's pocket. Her hands trembled as she inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked, and the lid creaked open to reveal stacks of letters, photographs, and a leather-bound journal. The top letter was addressed to her in her father's handwriting. Eleanor, this is where our story begins and where you'll find the answers I never dared to give you. Our family's history is not what you think. These letters reveal truths about your grandfather, mother, and me. I hope they will help you understand why I made my choices and why I need you to carry this legacy forward. Start with the journal. It's where I left my heart and soul. Love, Dad. Eleanor opened the journal, her eyes scanning the pages filled with her father's thoughts, fears, and regrets. The first entry hit her like a punch to the chest. I failed Eleanor when she needed me most. After her mother died, I didn't know how to be the father she deserved. But it's not just grief that kept me distant. It's the truth about her mother's inheritance. I wanted to protect her, but I fear I've only built walls between us. If only she knew what her mother sacrificed to save our family. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes as she flipped through the pages, uncovering a story she had never known. Her mother, it seemed, had been more than the loving parent she remembered. She had been the backbone of their family, quietly enduring struggles Eleanor had never imagined. The letters revealed more shocking truths. A secret deal her grandfather had made to secure their family's future, an estranged relative who had tried to claim it, and her father's attempts to shield Eleanor from the fallout. It was a web of sacrifice and betrayal, held together by a love her father had struggled to express. As Eleanor sat alone in the chapel, surrounded by the remnants of her family's past, she realized that her father had left her more than a legacy. He had left her the pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. What had her mother sacrificed? Who was this estranged relative? And why had her father kept these secrets for so long? For Eleanor, the answers were no longer just about uncovering the past, but about finding the strength to move forward. The journal sat heavy in Eleanor's lap as she lingered in the chapel, the sound of the creek outside a soothing contrast to the storm raging in her mind. She reread the passages, each revealing another layer of her family's struggles and sacrifices. But the entries were only part of the story. The letters beneath the journal were addressed to various names Eleanor didn't recognize. Grace Palmer, Henry Caldwell, and someone simply called Elle. She picked up a letter marked, "For Eleanor," open last, and set it aside. Whatever her father had left her there, she wasn't ready to confront it just yet. Instead, she grabbed a letter addressed to Grace Palmer, intrigued by the unfamiliar name. Inside, her father's words were raw and confessional. "Grace, I owe you an apology for what happened after Margaret's death. My guilt, too, consumed me to see the harm I caused you and your family. What you did for Eleanor, no one else could have. I've kept our arrangement a secret, but I fear the burden has weighed on you more than it should have. I hope she'll forgive us both if she ever finds out the truth." Eleanor's heart raced. Who was Grace Palmer? And what arrangement was her father referring to? The more she uncovered, the more she realized how little she knew about her family. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the chest, her hands trembling as she reached for the next piece. A photograph of her mother, Margaret, standing arm in arm with a man Eleanor didn't recognize. On the back, someone had scrawled in delicate handwriting, "Margaret and Henry, 1972. Eleanor flipped the photo over again, staring at her mother's smiling face. Her chest tightened. Who was Henry? Could this man have been part of the secret her father had worked so hard to hide? Determined to find answers, Eleanor packed the letters, journal, and photo into her bag and locked the chest. She exited the chapel, the morning sun casting long shadows through the trees. Her next stop was Tom Ashford's office. If anyone knew who Grace Palmer or Henry Caldwell were, it would be her father's oldest friend. When Eleanor walked into Tom's modest law office, the older man looked up from a stack of papers, his expression softening at the sight of her. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Eleanor wasted no time. She placed the photo on his desk and slid it toward him. "Who is this man?" "Henry Caldwell. And what does he have to do with my mother?" Tom leaned back in his chair, his face betraying a flicker of recognition. "You've dug deep, haven't you?" he said, exhaling heavily. "Henry Caldwell was your mother's first fiancé." Eleanor's jaw dropped. "What?" Tom nodded. "They were engaged before she met your father. But something happened. Henry disappeared from her life under mysterious circumstances. It's not my place to speculate, but Margaret rarely spoke about him after they parted ways." Eleanor's mind reeled. Why had her mother never mentioned this? And why had her father kept Henry's existence a secret? "There's more, Eleanor," Tom said cautiously. He pulled a file from his drawer and slid it across the desk. "Your father instructed me to share this with you if you ever came looking." Eleanor opened the file to find legal documents, bank statements, and a will, all tied to an inheritance from Henry Caldwell. The money had been transferred to her mother years ago, hidden under a foundation her father managed secretly. That inheritance was the source of the funds her parents had used to support their community work. Her stomach churned. So, my mother, she was still connected to him? Even after they broke off the engagement? Tom nodded solemnly. "Henry never stopped caring about your mother, Eleanor. And in the end, his wealth became the foundation for everything your family built." Eleanor sat back, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. It was all too much. Her mother's past, her father's guilt, and now this mysterious connection to Henry Caldwell felt like a house of cards about to collapse. But Tom wasn't finished. "There's one more thing you need to see," he said, handing her a tiny envelope. Inside was a letter written by her mother. "My dearest Eleanor, there are truths in life we keep from the ones we love, not out of malice, but to protect them. I hope you'll understand that everything your father and I did was for you. If you're reading this, you found the pieces of the puzzle we left behind. And my only wish is that you use what we've built to continue the work that gave us purpose. You are stronger than you know, Eleanor. And no matter what you choose, know I will always be proud of you. Love always, Mom." Eleanor's hands shook as she read the words. The weight of her parents' legacy and their secrets settled on her shoulders. She truly felt the enormity of the choice before her for the first time. Later that day, Eleanor stood at the edge of Willow Creek, the photo of her mother and Henry clutched in her hand. The water rippled gently, mirroring her chaotic thoughts. She knew she couldn't unravel the past alone, but she wasn't sure where to begin. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "You okay?" Eleanor turned to see Jake, the local hardware store owner, standing a few feet away. They had gone to high school together, though he had stayed in town while she pursued her ambitions in Chicago. She nodded, though her expression betrayed her turmoil. "Just trying to make sense of everything." Jake stepped closer, his brow furrowed with concern. "Word around town is that you're digging into your family's history. People are curious, you know? They looked up to your parents." Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much to share. But something about Jake's steady presence felt comforting. "It's more complicated than I thought," she admitted. "There are things I didn't know about my parents, about what they were trying to do here." Jake nodded knowingly. "Your parents were good people, Eleanor. They gave so much to this town. You're not alone if you're trying to figure out their legacy. This town would rally behind you if you asked for help." Eleanor blinked, surprised by his words. "Why would they do that? I've been gone for years. Most of them barely know me." Jake shrugged. "Maybe, but they knew your parents. And from what I hear, you're more like them than you realize." Eleanor felt a lump in her throat. She had spent her entire adult life running from this town, from her family, from the pain of her mother's death. But now, standing at the edge of Willow Creek, she felt an undeniable pull to stay, to finish what her parents had started. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor turned to Jake. "I need your help," she said simply. Jake smiled. "I figured you'd say that. What's the plan?" Eleanor glanced at the letters and journal in her bag. "First, we figure out who Grace Palmer is. Then, we discover why my parents trusted Henry Caldwell's inheritance to build all of this. Whatever they were trying to accomplish, I must see it through." Jake nodded, his expression firm. "Then let's get to work." With renewed determination, Eleanor left Willow Creek, the echoes of her parents' legacy propelling her. There were still pieces missing, secrets waiting to be uncovered. But for the first time in years, Eleanor felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. The following day, Eleanor woke with a sense of urgency she hadn't felt in years. She sat at her father's old desk, the letters and journals spread before her, but her focus lingered on the name Grace Palmer. Who was this woman, and why had her father's letter suggested she played an integral role in their family's story? Jake arrived promptly at 9 a.m., carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one on the desk beside her and leaned over the scattered papers. "You look like you've been at this all night," he said, eyeing the dark circles under her eyes. "I couldn't stop thinking about it," Eleanor admitted, rubbing her temples. "Grace Palmer. She's tied to all of this somehow. My father's letter mentioned her, but there's nothing else about her here." Jake glanced at one of the documents. "If she was involved with your family, someone in town might know her. You'd be surprised how much people remember." Eleanor frowned. "If my father kept her a secret, why would anyone in town know anything?" "Secrets have a funny way of slipping through the cracks," Jake replied with a shrug. "Especially in a town like this." The two spent the morning visiting familiar spots, Claire's Cafe, the town's small library, and the general store, asking subtle questions about Grace Palmer. Most people shook their heads or said they hadn't heard the name in decades. But at the library, the elderly librarian, Mrs. Whitmore, paused at the mention of Grace. "Grace Palmer," she murmured, her brow furrowing as she sorted through her memories. "Yes, I remember her. She was a nurse at the hospital back in the 70s. A kind woman, but she left town suddenly, and no one ever heard from her again." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Do you know why she left?" Mrs. Whitmore hesitated, her gaze softening. "Rumors, dear. People said she was involved with someone important, someone who didn't want the world to know. But Grace was a private person. If there was a story, she took it with her when she left." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Jake. The pieces were starting to come together. Could Grace have been connected to Henry Caldwell, her mother's former fiancé? And if so, why had her father kept Grace's involvement a secret? As they left the library, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was close to uncovering something monumental. "We need to find out where she went," she said. Jake nodded. "Let's start at the hospital records. If she worked there, they might have something." The hospital, now the larger facility on the outskirts of town, had kept extensive archives dating back decades. Eleanor and Jake spent hours combing through old employee records, patient logs, and photographs. Finally, they found a faded file labeled Grace Palmer, Resignation. The file revealed that Grace had resigned in 1978, citing personal reasons. Attached was a note from her superior praising her dedication and compassion. But what stood out to Eleanor was a copy of a transfer request to a hospital in Portland, a lead that could bring them closer to the truth. "I'll drive us there," Jake offered. "It's only an hour away." The drive to Portland was quiet, each lost in their thoughts. Eleanor stared out the window, her mind swirling with questions. If Grace Palmer had been part of her family's story, why had her father never spoken about her? And why had her mother kept silent? The hospital in Portland was sprawling and modern, a far cry from the small-town facility Grace had left behind. Eleanor approached the records office with trepidation, presenting their limited information. After a tense wait, the clerk returned with a slim file. Grace Palmer worked here for 2 years before transferring again, this time to a private hospice, the clerk explained. We don't have further records, but the hospice might. As Eleanor flipped through the file, her eyes caught on a single line, next of kin. Margaret Caldwell. Her breath caught. Caldwell, she whispered, the name hitting her like a thunderclap. That's Henry Caldwell's last name. Jake leaned over to look. You think Grace was related to Henry? Maybe, Eleanor said, her voice shaky. But if that's true, then why would my mother? Her words trailed off as the implications sank in. If Grace was part of the Caldwell family, her mother's connection to Henry was far more profound than she had ever realized. Their next stop was the hospice where Grace had spent her final years. The building, though modest, was surrounded by carefully tended gardens, exuding a sense of peace. A nurse directed them to the administrator's office, where Eleanor explained her purpose. The administrator, a kind-looking man named Mr. Holloway, nodded thoughtfully. Grace Palmer was one of our most dedicated nurses, he said. She spent her life caring for others. But toward the end, she became reclusive. She passed away here about 10 years ago. Eleanor felt a pang of sadness for the woman she had never met, but who seemed so integral to her family's story. Did she leave anything behind? Any records or personal effects? Mr. Holloway hesitated. There is one thing, he said, opening a drawer and pulling out a small envelope. She left this with instructions to give it to her family, should they ever come looking. Eleanor's hands shook as she took the envelope. The words were written on the front in elegant handwriting, to Eleanor Grace. Jake stared at the envelope. She knew you'd come, he said quietly. Eleanor opened it carefully. Inside was a letter and a photograph of Grace standing beside a younger version of her mother. The letter. Dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, you've come searching for the truth, a truth I hoped you'd find when the time was right. Your mother, Margaret, was my sister. Few knew this because of the stigma attached to our family's name. Henry Caldwell was my cousin, and he loved your mother deeply, but their engagement ended because of the expectations placed on him by our family. When Margaret chose your father, she chose love over duty, but Henry never stopped caring for her. After your mother married James, she contacted me, offering me a place in her life and a role in your family. I accepted but stayed in the shadows, helping without disrupting my parents' lives. The inheritance Margaret used to build her foundation came from Henry's estate, but your father protected it, ensuring it was used for the greater good. Eleanor, your parents made choices out of love. Choices that weren't easy, but they were always meant to give you the best life possible. Now, it's your turn to decide what comes next. Don't let the weight of their secrets hold you back. Use what they left you to build something beautiful. With love, Grace Palmer. Eleanor sat in stunned silence, the letter clutched in her hand. Her mother had a sister, an entire branch of her family she had never known. And the inheritance that had funded her parents' work had come from Henry Caldwell, a man who had loved her mother until the end. Jake placed a hand on her shoulder. Are you okay? Eleanor nodded, though her heart felt heavy. I think I finally understand why my parents kept this from me. They wanted to shield me from the pain, the complications of the past. Jake's voice was soft. But now that you know, what will you do? Eleanor looked at the photograph of Grace and her mother, the two women united by love, sacrifice, and an unshakable bond. I'm going to honor their legacy, she said firmly. Whatever it takes. Eleanor returned to her father's house, clutching Grace's letter and the photograph like a lifeline. The revelation swirled in her mind, reshaping everything she thought she knew about her family. Her mother's sacrifice, her father's quiet guardianship, and Grace's unwavering support all painted a picture of a legacy built on love, resilience, and trust. But they also carried an unspoken challenge. What would Eleanor do with this knowledge? Jake found her later that evening, sitting on the porch with a distant look in her eyes. He didn't say anything at first. He just handed her a cup of tea and sat beside her. Finally, she broke the silence. They gave up so much, she murmured, staring at the fading sunset. My mother could have lived a completely different life. My father carried the weight of protecting something that wasn't even his. And Grace stood in the shadows so my family could thrive. Jake tilted his head. Now it's your turn to decide what their sacrifices mean. Eleanor nodded, the weight of her choice settling on her shoulders. She had always been driven by ambition, but now, for the first time, she felt pulled by something more profound, a responsibility to carry forward the legacy her family had built. She thought of the community center her parents had funded, the shelter for women her mother had dreamed of expanding, and the town that had quietly depended on them. We need to finish what my mother started, Eleanor said firmly. The community center, the shelter, everything. It's time to turn her vision into reality. Jake's lips curved into a small smile. You've got a lot of people here who'd be willing to help, you know. You just have to ask. The following day, Eleanor organized a meeting at the town hall. News spread quickly, and the room was filled with curious townspeople by no one. Some were hesitant, others hopeful, but all were eager to hear what the long-absent daughter of James and Margaret Grace had to say. Eleanor stood at the front, the nerves twisting in her stomach, starkly contrasting to the confidence she'd once wielded in boardrooms. She took a deep breath and began. I know many of you remember my parents, she said, her voice steady despite the emotions bubbling beneath. You may not know just how much they sacrificed for this town. My mother dreamed of building more than just a home here. She wanted to create a place where everyone could thrive, no matter their circumstances. She paused, scanning the room. Faces softened, and nods of recognition rippled through the crowd. She didn't just leave us a dream. She left us the means to make it real. My father protected her vision, my Aunt Grace supported it, and now it's time for us to finish what they started. Eleanor outlined her plans, expanding the shelter, renovating the old Miller building into a fully functional community center, and creating programs for education, job training, and childcare. She ended with a plea for unity. This is more than just honoring their memory, she concluded. It's about building something together, something that lasts. The room erupted in applause. Standing at the back, Jake caught her eye and gave her a reassuring nod. Eleanor felt a surge of hope. For the first time, she wasn't just fighting her parents' battles, but creating her path forward. Over the next few weeks, the town came alive with activity. Volunteers came daily to help with renovations. Donations poured in from unexpected places, and Eleanor found herself at the center. But the more progress they made, the more complicated things became. One afternoon, while sorting through her father's old files, Eleanor stumbled upon a set of documents that stopped her cold. They detailed a legal battle between James Grace and Henry Caldwell years before Eleanor was born. At the heart of the dispute was the inheritance Henry had left Margaret, a fortune that another member of the Caldwell family had contested. The records hinted at threats, lawsuits, and accusations that could have ruined her parents' reputation. Eleanor's mind raced. Had her father gone to court to protect the inheritance? Was that why he had been so secretive about their finances? She turned to Jake, who had joined her to review the plans for the community center. There's more to this than I thought, she said, handing him the documents. My father fought to keep the inheritance out of the Caldwell family's hands. But why? Jake scanned the papers, his brow furrowing. It looks like someone in the Caldwell family wasn't happy about your mother receiving the money. Maybe they thought it should have stayed in the family. Eleanor's thoughts flickered to Robert Caldwell, the investor who had recently offered to buy her parents' property. Could he be connected to this? And if so, why was he still interested in the land after all these years? Her suspicions deepened when she received a call from her lawyer, Howard Greenwood. Eleanor, he said, his tone grave, Robert Caldwell's legal team has just contacted me. They're claiming your mother misused the inheritance and are threatening to contest your right to the property. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. On what grounds? They're alleging that the inheritance was conditional and that your parents didn't meet those conditions, Howard explained. I'm digging into the details, but you must be prepared for a fight. As the town rallied around the community center project, Eleanor wrestled with the mounting pressure. Every step forward felt shadowed by the threat of losing everything. Jake noticed her growing tension one evening as they worked late at the shelter. "You're carrying too much alone," he said gently. "Let us help." Eleanor shook her head. "This isn't just about the project, Jake. If Caldwell wins, we could lose everything. My parents' legacy, the center, the shelter." Jake placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then we fight. You're not alone in this, Eleanor." His words bolstered her resolve. The next day, Eleanor called a town meeting to share the news. She expected anger, disappointment, and maybe even doubt. But what she received was unwavering support. "This town has been through worse," an older woman said, standing up from the crowd. "If Margaret Grace believed in us, we can believe in Eleanor." The room erupted in cheers, and for the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt the strength of the community behind her. As Eleanor prepared for the legal battle ahead, she delved deeper into her father's files and Grace's letters, searching for anything to bolster her case. One night, she found a sealed envelope hidden in the back of the chest from the chapel. Inside was a handwritten note from Henry Caldwell. "To James, Margaret chose you, and I've made my peace with that. But the money I've left her isn't just a gift. It's a chance to rewrite the Caldwell family's legacy. Use it wisely and protect it at all costs. Some people would destroy what we've built if they could." The note was the confirmation Eleanor needed. Henry Caldwell hadn't just left the inheritance out of love. He had entrusted it to her parents to break the cycle of greed and manipulation in his family. It was a responsibility her parents had upheld at significant personal cost, and now it was Eleanor's turn to do the same. As the legal battle loomed, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. The secrets of the past had finally come to light, and with the support of her community, she was ready to defend the legacy her family had built. The courtroom was packed. Eleanor sat at the plaintiff's table beside her lawyer, Howard Greenwood, her heart pounding as whispers rippled through the crowd. Across the aisle sat Robert Caldwell, his expression calm, almost smug. His legal team shuffled through papers, their confidence palpable. The stakes were clear. This wasn't just about property but the town's future and the legacy Eleanor's parents had built. The proceedings began with Caldwell's lawyer presenting their case. They argued that the inheritance Henry Caldwell left Margaret had specific conditions tied to its use, conditions they claimed had been violated. The funds were meant to benefit the Caldwell family, not be squandered on unrelated projects, the lawyer asserted, his tone sharp. Eleanor clenched her fists under the table. Squandered? Her parents had poured their lives into helping this town. When it was Howard's turn, he presented the letters Eleanor had discovered, including Henry's note to her father. He read it aloud, letting the courtroom hear Henry's intention to break the cycle of greed within his family. This was a gift, Howard emphasized, entrusted to Margaret Grace not as an obligation but as an act of faith in her character. Caldwell's team countered by producing documents they claimed showed financial mismanagement. Margaret Grace moved funds in ways that were not transparent, Caldwell's lawyer said. These actions suggest misuse, if not outright fraud. The murmurs grew louder, and Eleanor's stomach churned. She knew they were referencing the discrepancies she had found in her mother's financial records, discrepancies that had haunted her since the discovery. What if they were right? But then Howard called an unexpected witness, Rita, one of the older women from the shelter. Rita's testimony changed the mood in the room. Margaret Grace wasn't misusing funds, she said firmly. She was hiding them, for good reason. She helped women like me escape abusive homes. The money wasn't mismanaged. It was repurposed to save lives. Eleanor felt a lump in her throat as Rita recounted how Margaret had helped her and countless others in secret. She wasn't just spending money, Rita concluded. She was creating hope. As the trial continued, Howard presented evidence of the community center's impact, calling on other witnesses to share how Eleanor's mother and father had supported them. A teacher described how Margaret had funded after-school programs. A small business owner spoke of loans James had provided to keep her shop running during the recession, and a teenage boy shared how a scholarship from the Grace Foundation had changed his life. Caldwell's smug demeanor began to falter as the weight of the testimonies mounted. But his team wasn't done yet. They called Robert Caldwell to the stand, and he dropped a bombshell. "My cousin Henry never intended to give this fortune so recklessly," he said. "Margaret manipulated him into it. She knew how to exploit his guilt over their broken engagement." Eleanor's anger flared. How dare he reduce her mother's legacy to manipulation? When Howard cross-examined Robert, he revealed inconsistencies in his claims. Howard introduced records showing that Henry Caldwell had updated his will after Margaret's marriage to James, fully aware of how the funds would be used. "Henry trusted Margaret," Howard said. "That trust wasn't misplaced. What's misplaced is this attempt to discredit her years after her passing." The final day of the trial was tense. Both sides presented their closing arguments, and the judge retired to deliberate. Eleanor sat in the courtroom, her hands trembling as she clutched the photograph of her parents and Grace. She thought about all they had sacrificed, the sleepless nights, the quiet battles, the unwavering faith in something greater than themselves. She thought about the community that had rallied behind her, their faces full of hope and trust. Jake leaned over, his voice soft. "Whatever happens, you've already won. Look at what you've done, who you've become." Eleanor managed a small smile, but her heart still ached with uncertainty. What if they lost? What if Caldwell succeeded in dismantling everything her parents had built? When the judge returned, the room fell silent. His voice was steady as he began to deliver the verdict. "This case hinges on the intention behind Henry Caldwell's inheritance and whether Margaret Grace and her family upheld those intentions." Eleanor held her breath as the judge reviewed the evidence, referencing Henry's letters, Rita's testimony, and Margaret's work's impact on the town. "It is clear to this court that Margaret Grace acted in good faith, using the funds entrusted to her in a manner consistent with Henry Caldwell's wishes. The claim of misuse is unfounded." Relief washed over Eleanor, and the courtroom erupted in cheers. But the judge wasn't finished. However, he continued, "The trust's future depends on the continued oversight of responsible parties. Therefore, I am assigning a review board to ensure the funds are managed transparently moving forward, with Eleanor Grace as its primary trustee." Eleanor's eyes widened. She hadn't expected this. The responsibility felt immense, but as the room celebrated around her, she realized it was exactly where she was meant to be. That evening, the town gathered at the community center to celebrate. Jake found Eleanor standing outside, looking up at the stars. "You did it," he said, his voice warm. "We did it," she corrected, turning to him with a soft smile. "This was never just about me." Jake grinned. "So, what's next, Trustee Grace?" Eleanor looked out at the bustling crowd, the laughter and chatter of a community united. "We rebuild," she said, "and we grow. This town deserves more than just surviving. They deserve to thrive." Jake nodded, stepping closer. "And what about you? What do you deserve?" Eleanor met his gaze, her heart steady. "I think I've finally found it," she said simply. "A place to belong." Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace as they stood together under the stars. The journey had been more challenging than she'd ever imagined, but it had led her to exactly where she needed to be. Her parents' sacrifices, Grace's quiet support, and the town's unwavering trust had given her a purpose and a home. And for the first time, she felt ready to embrace the challenges, the responsibilities, and the unknown future. Eleanor spent the next several months overseeing the transformation of her family's vision into reality. The community center, once a hollow promise, now stood as a bustling hub of hope and opportunity. Volunteers poured in daily, painting walls, assembling furniture, and creating spaces where lives could be rebuilt. One of Eleanor's most ambitious projects was the renovation of the shelter her mother had supported. She expanded its capacity and created transitional housing for women and children, offering them a safe place to stay and a pathway to stability. One evening, as Eleanor reviewed the shelter's new program outlines, Jake walked into her office carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You're still here?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. She looked up, exhausted but smiling. "There's so much to do. The teen mentorship program starts next week, and the job training initiative kicks off in 2 days. Jake placed the coffee on her desk and pulled up a chair. "You've done enough for one day. Maybe it's time to rest?" Eleanor chuckled. There's no rest when trying to rebuild a community. Jake leaned back, his expression soft. You've done more than rebuild, Eleanor. You've inspired. People talk about you like they talked about your mother, like you're the heart of this town. Her smile faltered, replaced by a deep emotion she couldn't quite name. I don't know if I deserve that. Jake reached across the desk, taking her hand. You do. And I think your mother knew you would. Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat, but she nodded. Thank you, she whispered. The grand reopening of the community center brought the entire town together. The once-abandoned Miller building now boasted classrooms for GED programs, a state-of-the-art computer lab, childcare facilities, and even a tiny garden in honor of Margaret Grace. Eleanor stood on the newly built stage, looking at the gathered crowd. Her voice trembled as she began. A year ago, I stood in this town as a stranger, someone who had run away from the things that mattered most. But today, I stand here as someone who finally understands the importance of home, family, and community. She paused, letting her words settle. This center isn't just about my parents' legacy. It's about all of you, the people who make this town what it is. Together, we've built something that will last for generations. As she cut the ribbon, the crowd erupted in cheers. Jake stood off to the side, smiling proudly. Eleanor caught his eye, and momentarily, the crowd's noise faded. She had found her place, and it felt more right than anything. Months later, as the center thrived and the town flourished, Eleanor visited her mother's grave. She carried a small memory box she had assembled with souvenirs from the journey that had changed her life. The graveyard was quiet, the wind rustling through the trees. Eleanor knelt beside Margaret's headstone, placing the box gently on the ground. "Hi, Mom," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately, about the sacrifices you made, the strength you had. I never understood it before, but now I do." She opened the box, pulling out a few items. The letter Grace had written, a photo of her parents, and a small token from the community center, a keychain engraved with the center's name. "We did it," Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "The center is everything you dreamed it could be. And the town, they're thriving because of you." A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she smiled. "I finally understand what you and Dad were trying to teach me. It wasn't just about leaving a legacy, but about living one. About being part of something bigger than yourself." Eleanor stood, her heart lighter than it had been in years. As she walked back to her car, she felt the wind shift, almost as if her mother's presence lingered in the air, offering one final blessing. Back in town, Eleanor joined Jake on the porch of her childhood home. The restored house had become a symbol of her family's enduring strength. Children laughed in the distance, playing in the center's garden, while adults gathered for workshops and classes. Jake handed her a cup of tea. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, his tone playful. Eleanor smiled, looking out at the town she had once fled from. "I was just thinking about how much has changed," she said. "How much I've changed." Jake nodded. "It's been a journey, hasn't it?" She turned to him, her expression earnest. "It has, but I wouldn't trade any of it. For the first time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Jake reached for her hand, his touch steady and warm. "And where's that?" Eleanor smiled, squeezing his hand. "Right here. Home." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Eleanor felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had found her purpose, community, and a love she never expected. Her parents' sacrifices, Grace's quiet strength, and determination led her to this moment. A life built not on ambition but connection and hope. The stars began to emerge, and Eleanor whispered a quiet promise to herself to continue her parents' work and honor the past while building a brighter future. And with Jake by her side, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage, love, and the unwavering belief that home was where she was meant to be.